Hello, friends. This is Michaela at HeartScapes Homestead and Studio, also known as my home and workspace. And we support people who are moving through significant transition to move from fear and uncertainty to intuitive clarity so that you can become a savvy navigator of your life and your choices. And I started this YouTube channel a little while back, mainly to share the practices and insights that come from that work. And as I decided to re-engage with this channel and begin making videos again, I realized that I can't really disassociate my work in the realm of wellness and energy work and people engaging their own healing process. I couldn't dissociate that from my work with the land and my garden and the medicine herbs and plants that I work with personally and in my work. So it felt really kind of exciting and just generative to restart these videos with a focus on the land and on how this wellness studio is in relationship to the life that is on this land. And that was also spurred by a Facebook post I made recently that shared some new garden beds that I'm installing, and there was just a ton of interest and a ton of questions about that process, and people really wanting to learn about it. And so I thought this would be a great way to begin sharing that. So this will be the first in several kind of garden and homestead tours that I'll share here in this space. So let's get into it. To begin with, it's important to acknowledge that my home and my studio and my practice and my garden are all situated here in Davis, California, on unceded land inside the territories of the Nisenan, the Southern Maidu people, and the Lake Miwok people. And in deep gratitude and reverence for the opportunity to live here on this beautiful land and to steward it, I take great care in how I engage with the plants, the animals, the structure, the bones of this place. And that extends, of course, to my gardening. So I want to just share some of the logistics of what I'm doing and just kind of how that all ties together with what we're about here at HeartScapes. So you can see here behind me, there are two fairly large raised beds. Let me just tilt that a little bit. You can see them a little bit better. The one far away here is 8 feet long by 3 feet, and the one here is 6 feet long by 3 feet. And as you can see, they're situated on a concrete patio. And this is because I've found that my land, while there's a fairly good sized backyard, a fairly good sized front yard, there's also very old, well-established trees and almost no direct sunlight anywhere on the property for more than a couple of hours a day, which means that it's not a very good place to grow most vegetable crops. And so I've lived here for almost 10 years and tried to garden vegetables, as I had done extensively in the Bay Area where I moved from, and it just was not working. And I actually gave up gardening almost altogether for a long time, which was really sad. But when I came back to it, I realized that the kind of scattered sun situation in the backyard is actually really ideal for growing herbs. And so I have a pretty extensive herb garden, culinary and medicinal herb garden in the back, which is wonderful. I still wanted to have my own tomatoes and my own zucchini and peppers and, you know, all of that wonderful garden produce that really matters, you know, to produce here on your own property, particularly in times of uncertain access to food, as we're experiencing now. We're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and food supplies are getting a little wonky, a little weird. And it's just a reminder that, you know, we really want to keep the systems that produce what we most need, our vital infrastructure, as close to home as possible. And for me, that starts with food. So I was just really concerned about being able to grow food on this property. And so I spent about a week, month or so ago, just doing a really careful site observation process. And this is a, you know, straightforward, super valuable, kind of obvious thing to do that we don't always necessarily take the time to do. To spend time with no agenda, with no attachment to plans, with no judgment as much as possible, simply observing what is true in our space. Whether we're looking inside of ourselves, seeing what is actually true inside of our personal landscape or in our physical landscape. And so what I realized is that there's exactly one place on my property that gets the 7 to 8 hours of direct sun a day that's needed for most vegetables. And that is right here on this front patio. In fact, right up to the line that is now the edge of these beds, where the sun passes over the roof line and we get a hard shadow from the roof. This side is in deep shadow, this side is in bright sun, almost all day in the spring and the summer. I'm not entirely clear how it's going to be in the winter, so that remains to be seen, but I'm hoping I still get some really nice morning sun when the sun is over here, enough to grow some brassicas, some leafy greens, some of the stuff that doesn't need so much direct light. So that was exciting to me, right? I finally have a place where I can grow some vegetables, but it also presented some significant challenges. First of all, it's on concrete. It's on a concrete patio. And it's also in a place that I don't have great access to water. So the patio problem was solved by working with these tall beds. And there's actually a few different reasons I chose to go with these really tall, they're 30 inches high raised beds. First of all, it's easier on my back. You know, like most gardening, you're bending over, you're hunching, you know, the knees and the back can get a lot of wear. So it's really nice to bring your garden up to, you know, waist high. And secondly, this allows me quite a bit of depth to build essentially a self-contained ecosystem that will hold my garden. Now, technically, it would be good enough to, you know, have a raised bed that's maybe a foot, 18 inches, maybe 2 feet up, and fill it with soil, you know, good composted soil, that the roots of the veggies would have enough room to go down in there. But that would be an incomplete ecosystem. And again, going back to the value of really tending my land as well as I can to align it with the natural cycles that are here and with the energy imprint and the environmental imprint that was here before, long before me. And so both for that reason and for the just overall health and longevity of my garden here, I wanted to, as much as I can, recreate a natural ecosystem here. And so we can do that using gardening and farming principles from permaculture. The permaculture, if you haven't heard that word, basically stands for permanent, perma, and culture. In this case, meaning the cultivation of plants. So like agriculture, aggregating the the cultivating of plants. So in this case, we're designing a permanent structure that is more self-sustaining, is more self-feeding, that requires fewer like inputs and fewer kind of interventions that are necessary when we grow in these kind of conventional agricultural ways. And so that begins with kind of recreating what would happen in nature, right? Permaculture is about designing our food and plant cultivation systems to, as much as possible, mimic what happens in the natural world. Because of course, nature is entirely self-sustaining. It is entirely self-regenerating. It is entirely designed to take the dead and turn it back into the living. And we have spent significant time in our human culture being very smart and finding interventions and ways of kind of bypassing that system, which has given us short-term gain, increase in productivity and simplification of processes, but it's given us a long-term disaster in terms of the sustainability of our land and our people, which I'm not going to go into right now, but safe to say I wanted something different from here. So I'm using a gardening process called hugelkultur. And hugelkultur is a permaculture process that was named in Germany, but it's actually just describing a process that has been used forever and ever, first by nature and then by people. And that's basically mimicking what happens on the forest floor. So hugel means hill, and culture, cultivating plants. So cultivating plants in a hill design. And to help understand this, you can imagine, what happens when a tree falls in the forest or it drops a giant branch in the forest and it settles into the ground, and the fall comes and the leaves drop and bury that branch or that tree, and those leaves break down over the winter and more things fall, and by the springtime there's a little bit of soil and the wood is starting to erode, and mycelium is starting to get in there, so funguses are starting to come in, and eventually over a couple of seasons what you end up with is this rich, beautiful soil that's building on top, being fed by this piece of wood that's slowly decaying below. And because it's so big and thick, the decay of the carbon inside of the wood is slow, meaning it's not rapidly drawing nitrogen resources from the soil above. When we want to compost something really fast, but we don't need to actually use that compost immediately, we can use like wood chips for carbon mixed with, say, leaves, green leaves, or manure for nitrogen, mix them all together, and they'll really, really quickly cook into soil. But while it's doing that, you can't use the soil because the process is using up all of the energy and the nutrients. So we want to slow that down. So I'm gonna just tilt you down in here. So what you can see here, I've started on the first couple of layers here. So you can see these larger pieces of wood, large branches that I just collected from my own property and from my neighbors that I laid there on the bottom. And actually below the wood is 8 inches of gravel and then some landscaping plastic underneath to mitigate the seepage of soil onto the concrete patio. So you would not have to do that if you were building this in the ground, but because I'm on concrete, I'm added this kind of filtration system. Hopefully it works. So again, we have these larger logs here mimicking our forest floor logs, and then smaller branches that I just kind of tucked in all of the corners to kind of fill up as many gaps as possible. And then I've started bringing in this compost from my cat litter composting, actually, which is not good to use directly on food plants, cat litter compost. Even though you let it compost for a couple of years, it's still just possibility of there being some pathogens in it from the kitty litter. And so you don't use it directly on food plants, but it's great for this fill situation. So that's just kind of filling in the gaps to kind of prevent there being too many air pockets. I'll then layer a layer of dried leaves and hay for some more carbon, kind of a thinner carbon layer right on top. On top of that will be greens. This is going to be a great opportunity to spur me to actually finish raking the fall leaves that are still down the side of my house over here, the kind of out of sight area that I just never got around to raking. There's plenty of old dry leaves there. So thank you, past self, for procrastinating on that task. And then also to do some of the pruning of the bushes that are now overgrown here in the springtime, so that I'll have my layers of carbon and nitrogen. On top of that, I'll put, probably pull out everything from my compost bin, where there's a lot of compost that's not quite all the way finished, not quite ready to be planted into, but will make a really lovely layer below. And then lastly, the last 10 inches or so will be fully composted manure and compost that is ready to be planted directly into. And hopefully that'll all be ready well before I need to get some fall crops in these beds. Because I'm doing this in a way that's really focusing on utilizing as many materials from my site, from my neighborhood as possible. Number one, because it's sustainable to do that, to source what we need from close to home and to conserve resources like money, and if we can. But of course, there's always a trade-off. If we don't spend money, if I don't spend money to have gravel and mulch and compost delivered to my house from a store, then I'm going to spend time and labor and effort and brute strength to haul those things here. So I've literally been hauling buckets of rocks, I'll be hauling buckets of compost from the back. I'll be going out to my friend's farm to haul compost from there. So it'll be a lot of sweat equity in these beds. But in terms of what's filling the beds, there's going to be $0 involved, which makes me really, really happy and proud to be able to basically build something significant that has significant value, you know, fertile soil that will grow many, many vegetables to feed my family, to be able to source that for almost no money, actually $0 in this particular case. I'm confident I can get all of my inputs that way. And that helps to offset the fact that I did choose to purchase these beds. Usually my inclination would be to try to build them myself, and I've built quite a few beds in the back. But knowing that I needed something really tall, substantial, you know, that's going to last a long time and that looks decent because it's right in my front walkway, my front door is right there. I just knew that I was not going to have it in me this season to build these things right. So I did choose to hire a local person who kind of does this as a side job. It felt good to be able to give him some work, and he built a beautiful, amazing product for me. A couple of you asked why I chose to use beds that have this corrugated metal siding rather than solid wood. So I wanted to address that. First of all, because it's really easy to build with. You know, it's just flat panels rather than boards nailed together. It's super sturdy, lasts a really long time. There's no toxic load to it. If it was to be built all out of wood, your options there are to either use chemically treated wood so that it doesn't rot. Most wood will rot out pretty quickly in a season or two if it's left untreated. That's a relatively cheap way to get lumber, but it also puts a pretty heavy chemical load into your bed. So if you're wanting to grow organically like I do, not a good idea. Alternately, you can build your bed with thick redwood or with cedar, better yet. Amazingly rot resistant wood naturally, but cedar or redwood are really expensive, like really expensive. So it would have cost me more in money to build these myself with wood, and it would have cost a significant more in time, which I didn't want to spend. In the wintertime, this metal also heats up a little bit and helps to keep the roots of the plants a little bit warmer in the cold months, and it doesn't seem to be a problem in the summer. That is what I have heard from people who swear by corrugated metal raised beds. So that is what I've got going on. I'm going to be focusing on the smaller one, the 6 foot first, getting it all put together, and then I'll move over to the 8 and hopefully be able to haul enough buckets of materials here to my house to make it work by fall. So that's my project, my current project. I've got quite a few projects going on in the backyard, and in my next video, I'll show you some of those. But for now, I want to leave you with an invitation into a practice. At HeartScapes, if you've done any classes or any circles with me, you'll know that we really emphasize shifting from kind of the theory of the thing into the experience of it. So I'm just going to invite you at least one time over this next week to give yourself a period of time that feels manageable. Maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's a half an hour, maybe it's an hour, just whatever feels achievable for you in your life. And to take that time to do site observation in your home or somewhere else that you spend significant time in. And again, going back to what I shared in the beginning about site observation, this is really an opportunity to release attachment to any plans that we have, any ideas, any thoughts we have about constrictions, you know, any thoughts that we have that like, oh, this won't work, any judgment that we have about the place that we live. You know, maybe we're not really happy with it, and so we don't really want to necessarily pay a lot of attention to the site. If you are in a position where you're like, look, I live in a dense urban place, and you know, there's no, you know, gardening, there's no nature here in this place, then in particular, I invite you into this practice, because what it allows us to do is really tune into the natural cycles that simply are present around us all the time. They simply are, no matter where we live. And so really what you're doing is, again, observing the place where you live or spend a lot of time without attachment to plans, and with the intention of simply noticing the life and the rhythms of life that are there. So by rhythms, I mean, for example, the passage of the light. So for me, I was really paying attention to where is the sunlight, how long does it hang out in different spots. Looking at the movement of animals through the space, insects, birds, squirrels, whatever, house cats and other pets. Paying attention to what is growing and where and how does it look like it's doing? Does it look like it needs something? Is it calling your attention for any particular reason? Noticing what phase of growth the plants are in. Are they just sprouting? Are they beginning to flower? Are they beginning to set fruit? Just noticing. And take a journal and just jot down everything that you notice in that period of time that you have designated. And just pay attention to what you notice and what happens. And I promise you that something surprising will happen. Just back to my example, I've lived here almost 10 years. I have told the story this entire time that there is nowhere on this property that I can grow vegetables. I never, ever, ever, not one time noticed that there's a 16 by 5-foot patch on my patio that's perfect for growing vegetables. I had this story that I can't do it, and I had this story that the concrete was a limitation, and I wasn't able to look past that story. So spend some time observing your land, notice what happens, let go of the stories that you might have about it, and let me know what you experience. I would love to hear about it. You can drop it in the comments. You can email me directly at michaela@heartscapesinsight.com. And I will see you again with a tour of the backyard, and we'll see what kind of practices want to come forward from there. Until then, thanks so much for hanging out with me, and I look forward to being with you again. Bye-bye.